Hello, everyone. First, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Quequitlam and Musqueam First Nations people. I'm Dr. Leslie Shannon, an associate professor in the School of Engineering Science and the President's Dream Colloquium Chair this year. This year's colloquium is on women in technology, recruitment, retention, and promotion. In addition, I'm also an associate professor in addition to being an associate professor and the colloquium chair, I'm also the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, or NSERC, chair for Women in Science and Engineering for the BC Yukon region, and run a program called the West Coast Women in Engineering, Science, and Technology, or WEST, which is a much nicer acronym to try and remember for anyone who wants to look us up later, based at SFU, so that's WWEST. Our mission is to engage industry, the community, and students to increase the awareness and participation of women and other underrepresented groups in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM fields of study and careers. At West, and this chair inspired the creation of this particular colloquium topic because we wanted to educate participants on the challenges and solutions that have been identified to improve diversity in hiring, retention, and promotion to leadership roles for women. The President's Dream Colloquium is made up of a speaker series as well as a graduate course. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Stephen Spencer, who is the Robert K. and Dale J. Weary Chair in Social Psychology at Ohio State University. Dr. Stephen Spencer is a preeminent scholar of stereotypes and prejudice and their effects on people's self-concept and academic performance. He published the pioneering study, A Stereotype Threat on Women's Math Performance in 1999 article that has been cited over 2,500 times. Dr. Spencer has more than a decade of experience at the University of Waterloo, researching how implicit biases affect women in math and engineering. And his more recent experience is in conducting and assessing the overall effectiveness of longitudinal interventions in educational contexts, including the new Engendering Success in STEM Research Consortium, of which both of us are a member, and we're really excited about it. So if you'd like to learn more about it, it's called successinstem.ca, and it's aimed at addressing these issues for children, young adults, all the way through university students and early career individuals. And so now I'd like to give a chance for Dr. Spencer to talk about women in technology improving performance in the environment, some of the social psychological phenomena that we encounter. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you for coming. I would have to drop the mic to start out. Okay. Well, I've never had a talk that I felt I should drop the mic at the end, so maybe we'll just do it at the beginning here. But I should start by acknowledging my collaborators. So Christine Logel and Crystal C. are two of my former graduate students. The laboratory studies I'm going to talk about were Christine's dissertation, PhD dissertation. Crystal was integral throughout the whole intervention projects we're going to talk about. Stephanie and Christopher are current graduate students, and they played a big role in both of the interventions. I'll talk at the end. And Mark Zana has been my colleague since I started at the University of Waterloo. We've done a bunch of research together. Mark's now retired, but I really need to give him credit every time I talk about any of this stuff because he was instrumental in doing all of it. So I should start with that. I'm going to try and give you really an overview of research that I've been working on for about 7 or 8 years. I won't go back to the earliest research. I'll talk about the very first study we did, or the first study that I did on stereotype threat. But I'm going to leave some of the history out. I want to start with just our simple schematic, really. You could almost call it a model, basic idea about how stereotypes in society affect women in STEM type of topics, whether it's math, whether it's engineering, technology. And what we want to outline is how do cultural stereotypes How do cultural stereotypes affect things that we care about, like performance in school? And disidentification really means, is a term that we use that really just means you don't care about that discipline as more. You can really, poor performance and disidentification, maybe a better way to describe it would be like grades and persistence. Dropout is kind of what we would expect to happen if people disidentify. So really, how do cultural stereotypes shape whether women stay in engineering and math and STEM type fields, and how does it affect how they actually do in those areas? So we're going to look at that primarily in terms of things like grades and retention. And really, for us, the central concept is that explains that is what we call social identity threat. Now, social identity threat is a sense that there are stereotypes that exist in society that are out there in the air, and those stereotypes can undermine. And those stereotypes are something that you realize, although it's not a particular person that may try and use that stereotype, it's something by which you might be judged. And so women, when they're studying math and science, particularly when it gets hard, and as you go further in a domain, it's always going to get hard at some point, particularly when it gets hard, you have the additional thing that you have to worry about is that stereotype that I know that's out there. Even if I don't believe it, is it something that I might be evaluated based on? Are people going to think about me based on that stereotype about my group? And that's what and it doesn't have to be any particular person, and it's not like, will Joe think about this? Now, if you worry about Joe thinking about you like that, then you will be experiencing stereotype threat, but there doesn't have to be a particular Joe. Doesn't have to be a particular person. There's just an accusation that's out there in the air. And that's the phenomenon that we wanted to look at. We're not going to have any overt expression of stereotype in these particular studies. As you're going to see, what people are doing is really simple. They're taking tests or working in environments that are typical environments. And when we do nothing, we can see underperformance. We can see lack of retention. We can see problems. But if you address this issue of social identity, or sometimes we call it stereotype threat, when you address this, then actually you see the performance increase and do better. So let me try and describe the very first study that we did. It was relatively simple. And what we did is we brought in men and women who were actually exceptionally talented in math. We did this study at the University of Michigan, and all of them had taken second-year calculus and gotten a B or better. All of them had standardized test performance that put them in the top 10% in the US. And all of them said, I'm good at math, and it's important to me to be good at math. So this isn't your typical type of university student. This is somebody who is good at math. They've taken a fair bit of math, and it's meaningful to them personally. Now, when they came in, we gave them a math test that, despite these people being really good at math, we knew was going to kick them in the butt. We gave them the advanced GRE in mathematics. Now, the advanced GRE in mathematics is for people who've completed a math major. And those of you who've taken math, you realize that there's a little bit more to math than just Calculus 2. You can do absolutely well in Calculus 2, and you don't know all you need to know yet. These students aren't used to this experience, but the test is really, really hard. And in fact, nobody that we gave the test to in the whole study got more than half of them right. It's a hard exam. Now, this is meant to mirror the experience that you have whenever you go up in a level and you first study something and you're kind of confused. It's a challenging new concept. That's what we're trying to distill in this laboratory experience. And that's what you have at a number of places in math and pretty much any domain. There comes a point when you get a new concept that's hard to understand, hard to make sense of. That's where we think social identity threat or stereotype threat, that's when we think it tends to emerge. Now, as they take this math test, we give them the standard instructions, but for half of them, what we told them is, on the first half of this test, one of the things that's really interesting about this new test that we developed is there's no gender differences. It's a problem that we had with other tests, but this one we actually were able to develop it to demonstrate there are no gender differences. In the other half, what we told them in the first part of this test, sadly, despite our best to get rid of gender bias and gender problems, there are gender differences on this test. It turns out that's not essential. If we tell them nothing and give them the regular directions, you get exactly the same thing, which we did in the next study. But what was special is telling them there's no gender differences. And what you see here is when we tell them there's no gender differences on the test, men and women perform about the same. Now, these scores are the way the GRE scores these things, which is you get, if there are 4 response items, you get 1/4 of a point off if you're wrong. If you leave it blank, you get a 0. And if you get it right, you get a full point. And this is in percentages kind of based on this. If you got them all right, you'd have 100%. If you got them all wrong, you would have like -5 on it. If you just guessed randomly, like a monkey, you'd get a 0, or average, you would get a 0. So people here aren't doing very well. What you see is if you tell them there's no gender differences, though, men and women are not doing differently. They're not doing differently. They get about the same score. When we tell them there are gender differences, we see a big difference between men and women. And as I said, if we tell them nothing, we see that same gender difference. Just give them the regular directions for the test and have them take it. We get exactly the same thing. If we can reduce this stereotype threat, the social identity threat, women's performance significantly increases. So we can manipulate these kind of things in the lab. So if we follow our little model that we're talking about here, cultural stereotypes can create this social identity threat is what we're arguing, and that social identity threat can result in poor performance. Now, there's a lot of research that we did on that in the early days. It's not just women in math, racial groups that there are stereotypes about, lower social economic status, lots of different groups. We can show the same sort of phenomenon. And we've shown that link from social identity threat to poor performance. We've shown that a bunch of different times. We've shown social identity threat to disidentification or dropping out of school a whole bunch of times. What I want to talk about today is how does those cultural stereotypes create that social identity threat? Where does this come from, and how does that process actually happen? Because on those original studies, we could do literally nothing, just give them the test, and we were seeing effect of the stereotypes. Where is this coming from? How does that have an impact? We are making the argument that these stereotypes in societies have this problem, but have we even shown that? What's that about? How do the stereotypes that we know about from culture, how do they create these feelings of social identity threat? And that era was something we didn't, before we started this research, we didn't look at at all. And it turns out, from my perspective, that's going to be a particularly important way to intervene and a particularly important way to think about this phenomenon. Changing the whole culture is a big task, something we should work on. It's going to be really, really hard. But reducing the effect of that culture might be something that's a little bit easier for us to do if we get a handle on how does that culture affect social identity threat. So in order to look at that, what we wanted to, we conducted a series of studies looking at how men and women interact with one another when they're working on an engineering task. And what we wanted to look at is, in particular, how the men's stereotypes could affect the women. Now, I'm going to tell you about, we also looked at, do the women's stereotypes themselves, do they matter? And I'll tell you about those results. But in particular, what we're interested in is how, when the men and women interact with one another, how do the men's stereotypes impact the women? So what and in particular, what we want to argue is it's the subtle sexist behavior on the part of men that creates the climate, that creates the impact of the cultural stereotypes, that men's subtly sexist behavior is what actually is that arrow between the cultural stereotype and social identity threat. That men, in the way they interact with subtly and treat women, is what creates the problem. And in study 1, what we're going to look at is, do men high in sexism interact differently than men low in sexism? So that's the particular question that we're going to ask. Because if sexism is going to be that arrow, what is it? Do men high in sexism interact any differently than men low in sexism? And then in study 2, what we're going to look at, does interacting with a man high in sexism, does that actually undermine women? And I'll lay out the logic a little bit more as we go along. So in study 1, we had 28 male engineers. This was highly, well, it was a big production value. Sometimes social psychology has to create in the lab basically little theater experiences, and that's what we did throughout these particular studies. The real subjects in this particular study were 28 men, and they were interacting with a female Confederate. The female Confederate was trained to act with all the men in exactly the same way. And she was given a script, and she followed the script. And we looked at how the men treated her differently based on their sexism. Now, we measured the men's sexism before they started, actually, and we did this in a kind of very subtle way. Before the task, we measured men's sexism by having them complete several sentences. Actually, there were 20 sentences they had to complete, and only 3 of them had to do with gender. One of those 3 sentences was, Jenny went home to cook dinner. Now, Jenny's obviously doing something stereotypic for women. She's cooking dinner. And we look at how the men actually complete that particular sentence. And I'll show you how we scored that and how we use that as a measure of sexism in just a second. Then we had, after they completed this measure and a whole bunch of other things, so this was very hidden, it's only 3 of the 20 sentences, and it's within a whole bunch of other measures they're completing as well. We then told them what the task was going to be, is that they were going to be interacting with another engineering student, and we were interested in how engineering students deal with contemporary issues. And the contemporary issue at that time is that there was an article in the New York Times which we had them read about the Compaq Hewlett-Packard merger, when that was a computer company, when Compaq was at the time, was going to merge with Hewlett-Packard. And the reason we picked it is the CEO who was going to lead this merged company was Carly Fiorina, and she's a female CEO of a big major company now, and we wanted to see what would happen as people talked about this. So that's what we had them do, and we videotaped the interaction, so we could see how the men behave actually in this particular interaction. Now, that's what we actually did. The measures here are all things we have to code. So let's code the sexism measure. So we had 2 students code the responses to the sentences to see how sexist they were. And it turns out we had very global coding and got good reliability because we just had them rate it sexist, neutral, well, very sexist, a little bit sexist, neutral, very non-sexist, and somewhat non-sexist. So 5-point scale, and we got good agreement. Jenny went home to cook dinner. It was completed, if it was completed, implying that men and women are equal, because Tim cooked dinner last night, which is an actual response, then we say that's very non-sexist. Jenny went home to cook dinner because Tim cooked dinner last night. Or with women in a modern role, Jenny went home to cook dinner after work. We coded that as very non-sexist. It could have been coded as, it could have been coded 1 in subtle sexism, very low in subtle sexism. If the completion portrayed historic roles of women, Jenny went home to cook dinner for her husband, that was 5 in subtle sexism, high in subtle sexism. Or as women as sex objects, these are all real responses. Or Jenny went home to cook dinner naked. That was judged high in sexism. So it actually wasn't that hard. It's a 1 to 5 scale. 3 is like kind of neutral. Jenny went home to cook dinner and made spaghetti. Would be a neutral thing. So we had them code that and how sexist it was. And there's 3 of these items, and they're all similar to that one. But then we had to code the videotape of the actual interaction. And we coded for several features of the interactions, but primarily, one of the things we were interested in is how close the man sat to our female confederate. Now, we had two couches in an L. The female confederate always sat in the middle of one of the couches, and none of the guys sat down on the same couch as she did. But they could sit all the way up on the other couch as close as they could to her, or they could sit on the very far end of the other couch, anywhere in between. And we just measured where it was they sat and how close it was to the couch that she was sitting in. So did they sit closer or did they sit farther away? Nice objective measure. We also measured their posture, which is really easy on the videotape, and it turns out to be a pretty meaningful measure. Was the men's posture more closed? Did they sit like this, or did they sit like this? Or did they sit with a more open posture? You know, and many of the guys sat like this. You know, both your legs and your upper body. I'm only demonstrating upper body, but you can imagine the rest. An open posture, or did they sit with a more closed posture? We also had the observers rate each of the male participants' dominance and sexual interest displayed in the conversation. So we had coders rate how dominant was this guy in the interaction. We can do it more objectively and get the same thing. We just, how much airtime was he having? It actually works a little bit better more subjectively, which could be kind of running the show. And sexual interest, that's a little hard to be objective about. That was a subjective rating that they tried to make. What is a little bit more objective included things like how much did the female confederate report that the male participant looked at her body? We would have loved to have the coders rate that. Unfortunately, about 30% of the men were wearing baseball caps. So it was our coders couldn't rate it because they couldn't tell where he was looking because his baseball cap was covering his eyes. But we could have the confederate who was working for us rate whether he was checking her out. And that ended up being a more objective measure of sexual interest. And what we actually find in this study really isn't that surprising. What we find is there was a strong relationship between men's score on the subtle sexism measure and their sexist behavior in the interaction with the female conservative, or the female confederate. So if the men said Jenny went home to cook dinner for her husband, they were more likely to be dominant in the interaction. They were more likely to have an open posture. They were more likely to check out her body as he was talking to her. They were more likely to do the subtle sexist behaviors. In some ways, this is, those of you who are psychologists, this is kind of a boring study. Really what all this almost is a validation in behavior of that the measure that we had of subtle sexism is actually measuring subtle sexism. Sexism as described in the measure actually is associated with sexist behavior. So really this isn't all that isn't all that groundbreaking or all that surprising. Our subtle sexism measure is measuring subtle sexism, and we can see that because it predicts subtle sexist behavior. The question is, does it have any consequences? And that's what we wanted to look at in the second study. And in the second study, we had 17 female engineers who are the primary subjects. And they interacted with a male confederate, actually a drama student, and we had a couple of them actually, and they were trained to either act like the men high or low in subtle sexism from study one. Now, we didn't actually even label it subtle sexism. We did a lot of coaching. We had good videotapes of guys who were high in subtle sexism and guys who were low in subtle sexism. We had good videotapes and we said, hey, here's a guy who is interacting in this tape like this. You act like that. And we pointed out the little bits that we wanted them to focus on. You know, when he sits like that, you sit like that. And that's going to be one condition. And you see this other guy, when he sits like this, is kind of quiet, lets his partner talk more. You act like that. So we coached them that way and directed them in that way and how they were going to do it. They were really good at picking it up. If you are a psychologist and you want to have really high-level confederates, get good drama students. I think it's totally worth it. They take on the role. They really kind of enjoy it. So that's what we did, and we hired these two male drama students to enact the roles. When acting high and subtle sexism, what they in fact did is they sat closer, maintained open posture, acted more dominant and sexually motivated than when, and they did the reverse when they were low in subtle sexism. So that's what we actually set up. And after this interaction, and in this one we don't even measure subtle sexism at all, we just have the interaction, and we're interested in the women. We had women take an important engineering test. The test that we give them is the Fundamentals of Engineering exam, which is just like the math test that we were talking about earlier. It's really, really hard for early engineering students. There's all kinds of stuff they're supposed to know by the end of their undergraduate career that they don't know yet. And it ends up being a really, really hard test. So it's exactly the same sort of conditions. What we actually find is that women who interacted with the Confederate who acted high in subtle sexism did worse on the exam. They got 11% on average than women who interacted with the Confederate who acted low in subtle sexism, 22%. So they were doing significantly better when they interacted with a guy low in subtle sexism than a guy high in subtle sexism. This, for us, is a confirmation that those cultural stereotypes have the effect on performance through the men who the women who are interacting with. They're the conveyors of that culture. And that's what we're actually finding in this particular study. And we didn't take it as necessarily enough. We actually replicated this study with a large group of men and women, and we had men and women who are all, we got rid of the no Confederates, all naive subjects. We have them interact with one another, but we measure both the men's and the women's subtle sexism ahead of time. Now, this isn't an experimental study, it's a correlational study, but do we see the same thing in the correlational study? Well, it turns out that men's score on that subtle sexism measure predicts their female partner's score on the engineering test when we have just men and women interact with one another. So the women's score is predicted by the man who they're interacting with, his subtle sexism score. Interestingly, it's not predicted by her own subtle sexism score on that, but it's predicted by his subtle sexism score. And this particular, with all naive participants, we totally replicated in that way, and we now have a prediction that men who are higher in subtle sexism, we see that affecting women's actual performance on a test. No, nothing caused by the Confederates. The Confederates just let us break down the causal chain. Let us show where the action is happening. Men who are high in subtle sexism act this way. If we control how those actions actually happen, we can see it affecting the women. But if we do it all really in the real world sort of way, where we have naive men and women all interacting with each other, we get the same sort of results. I think together these studies demonstrate that men's subtle sexist behavior can undermine women's performance. So if you think about this model that we were talking about at the beginning, whoops, I lost it. Oh, well, I lost my slide that I was hoping I had. If we think about this causal area where cultural stereotypes affect social identity threat, really men's behavior for women in this math and science is what's mediating that first arrow. That's what that first arrow is about. How do those cultural stereotypes create social identity threat? I think we can make the case that men's subtle sexist behavior create that sort of a phenomenon. The question that we had from that, though, is how do we get rid of this effect? Can we intervene? Can we intervene and provide women who are in engineering programs a way to cope with this stereotype threat through the cultural stereotypes that are present in the environment, that are conveyed by the men in the environment? Can we provide them a way to cope with this, with the social identity threat they're experiencing? So, if women's performance is caused at least in part by men's subtle sexist behavior, then giving women tools to cope with these behavior should allow them to do better. And we created two different interventions to help women cope with subtle sexism. The first one is based on some work that one of my postdoctoral students, Greg Walton, had done with Jeff Cohen, and they were looking at this with race and the effect of race on undergraduates' performance. And what they found was one of the crucial ingredients is whether people felt they belonged or not. And one of the problems when you face social identity threat in the environment, you can feel like, I don't fit here, I don't belong, this isn't the right place for me. And that can exacerbate these feelings of social identity threat and can be part of how social identity threat leads to problems with staying in school and getting good grades. So the intervention they did in that study, we basically translated it for looking at women in engineering. What we actually did is we created a presentation for people in this condition, and they read about, well, they actually get read to them. It's actually an audio intervention where they see a picture of somebody and they see a bit of the words and they hear the person talking and saying, you know, when I first went to the engineering program, you know, I felt like I really didn't fit in. I didn't know anybody. I felt on my own. I didn't know, you know, I didn't find any place that I really felt comfortable. But after I stuck at it for a while, I found that a group of friends, and they were in the Iron Warrior, which is the engineering newspaper, and I found my niche there, and, you know, after a while, I felt like I really fit in. Now, there were 10 students that they saw. 6 of them focused on this fitting in issue. Some of them were men, some of them were women. We actually had 4 men and 2 women who described this of the critical 6. We had a couple fillers, described this exact same experience, although not exactly the same. It was always a different area of engineering, a different way that they felt that they fit in. But they all, it's kind of like at the beginning, I don't feel like I fit in. That's kind of the meta story. After I've been here for a while, I found where I fit in and everything was fine and I took off. The idea is that if you're a woman who feels social identity threat, it gives you a different way to think about that social identity threat and can find you a different way to kind of cope with and overcome with it. Find the group of people that's going to make you feel comfortable, make you feel like you belong in this environment, and is a way to cope with it. The other intervention was based on other work by Jeff Cohen and Julio Garcia and Valerie Purdy-Vons. This work focuses on when you feel that social identity threat, what you can do is take a broader perspective and think about the values that are most important to you and use that as a way to cope with the pressure and stress you feel because of the social identity threat. And the work that they did was actually with junior high students, African-American junior high students in an integrated school in the States, and they found that just one writing an essay about a value that was important to them actually allowed those students to get much better grades. Throughout, you know, years later, actually, they were still getting better grades. We didn't do exactly that with women in engineering. Instead, what we had them do is, again, they saw 10 students describe describe different issues that were going on. There were 4 fillers, there were 6, and actually everything was the same except what these people said. In these 6 conditions, people talked about different values that were important to them and how they used those as a way to cope with stress and difficulty in their life as an engineering student. They talked about different values, all 6 of them did. Then we had the students in our study actually pick out what was for them the value that they focused on that was important to them, that would help them deal with stress and cope with things in their environment. And then we had them write the name of that value and put it on a keychain, and we made them put that keychain, their keys on that keychain, so they could carry that around with them when they felt stress and actually affirm themselves when they felt stress happening in their environment. So we had a belonging intervention and an affirmation intervention. We had a bunch of undergraduate engineers that were randomly assigned to one of these 2 conditions or a control condition. The control condition was something we kind of knew about from the University of Waterloo. One of my other colleagues had done research on a study skills course at the University of Waterloo, and one of the things that he found about that study skills course is it actually didn't help anybody get better grades, but everybody thought it did. So it was kind of a pleasant experience for them, but it actually didn't improve their grades at all. So our control condition is we set up the same sort of thing, the same 10 scenarios, 6 of which are crucial, with the 6 major things from the study skills course as ways to help them do better in their first year in engineering. So they all think it's great, but we're pretty confident it wouldn't really help them actually do better. It would have been nice, but that's what the previous research has shown. So we have a belonging intervention, an affirmation intervention, and a control group. So what we're really thinking about here is we want to break the link, the second arrows. We want to break those links so that when you have social identity threat, you give women a way to cope with it so that they actually do better. I just described all of this, so I'm going to skip it rather than show you the slides saying what I just said. Here's what the actual results show. And a caveat here, we found little underperformance in majors at the University of Waterloo where there's a fair bit of representation. Chemical, civil engineering. The majors at Waterloo break down nicely between those that have 30% or more women in them and majors that have actually 20% or less. There's no majors in between the 20% or less or 30% or more. These are for the majors where women are underrepresented: mechanical, mechatronics, electrical and computer engineering, software engineering, and I'm missing one, but those are the basic majors where you see this. What you see is that men in those majors, they average of 76 or so. And these are typical Canadian grades, 0 to 100 percentage. That's what men average. Women in the control group in those majors are doing significantly worse, 66%. But both of our intervention conditions totally reverse that, and women are doing just as well as men as they're doing that. So this is, kind of really nice information that we're getting that we can overcome these particular issues. Interestingly, there's evidence that they don't work in the same way. And we can see that particularly by looking at the friends that they develop. In the belonging condition, if we look at they're supposed to report their 5 closest friends. In the belonging condition, women in that condition have significantly more male engineering friends than women in the control condition or the affirmation condition. In the affirmation condition, interestingly, women in that condition have more female friends outside of engineering in their 5 closest friends. So I think both of those are consistent with what we're suggesting as a coping strategy. Women in the belonging condition actually seem like they belong more, and they report having more male friends in engineering. Women who are using other things to cope actually seem to be using other things to cope, and they have friends, consistent with those other things, and that seems to be how they're coping with the social identity threat they feel. Okay. So we were encouraged by those results, but actually, as I started to think about it, I was discouraged in a way, because it's an awful burden to place upon women. Okay, we know the stereotype threat exists. We know it's the men's behavior in the environment that's a conduit of that. You have to cope with it. We can give you a few things to do, but here, it's your job to cope with it, which didn't really seem like the right response. Instead, what we realized in this next intervention is that if we know that this cultural stereotype is affecting social identity threat through that first arrow, can we do something about that first arrow? And this is something that we're just beginning to try to do. And in particular, can we take men and have them display less of the subtle sexist behavior? Can we do something to try and convince men that they shouldn't engage in that sort of behavior? Now, we know that that's going to be challenging. In fact, Mark Zana often talks about, changing people's attitudes in social psychology, we've often done that when their attitudes are actually not really attitudes, not things they really care about. It actually are pretty easy things to change. Like we change a huge amount of my colleagues at Ohio State's research on persuasion is persuading people about an end of an exam that you might have to take at the end of your undergraduate degree, which is totally fake and made up and everybody knows it. Changing attitudes about that may be very different from changing deep-seated attitudes that people care about. And we recognize that these attitudes about gender are not going to be the super easy attitudes to change. They're hard to change attitudes. How do we go about doing that? Well, one of the things that we wanted to do in this study is what Mark Zanuck calls a two-step persuasion. The idea is you create in people a state that then makes it easier for them to be persuaded, that you can use for your persuasive appeal. So that's what we're going to try and do. So was to start out with, we have 151 male first-year engineering students, and we had 4 conditions. Now, the crucial intervention is this two-step persuasion. What we actually do is we use that same self-affirmation procedure that I'm describing when you think about an important value. But one of the things that that does, which we've shown in other research, is it makes people much more open-minded. But not just open-minded in general, more open-minded to good ideas and actually less open-minded to bad arguments. So if you want to persuade somebody, the idea here is you affirm people so that they can take perspective on it, can think critically about it, and actually process the arguments carefully. And you make good arguments. That's what we were trying to do. So the intervention includes self-affirmation and a persuasive appeal, plus 3 sessions to back it up, that actually women are a lot more competent than you've recognized. Based on the research that we talked about previously, we make a really good case that women are more competent than they've realized. We also have a control condition that just had the persuasive appeal without the self-affirmation, didn't follow it up with additional sessions to try and drive it home. Is it just a simple persuasive message? Would it work regardless? That's a control condition, which controls for the information that's presented without changing the psychological state first. We also had a contact condition based on contact theory, which we know contact theory can reduce prejudice between groups. And we actually did the very best Cadillac contact version where we had people interact with, in 3 sessions between men and women. We used the jigsaw technique where people have to work together and rely on one another as they're doing it. We actually set it up so that we fed them information that they actually shared shared things that mattered to them in common with each other. We tried to build as good a contact as we could possibly build. And then we had a real control for the contact condition, which there isn't room for here, but we basically just had them interact as they normally interact. That's all that we would have them do. So they still have 3 sessions where they interact, but none of the contact stuff built into it. So if I want to show you this as a schematic, in the critical intervention condition, we had affirmation, persuasion. We had male and female TAs. As they did it, they built a bridge together. The male and female TAs model respect. They build a tower. The male and female TAs model respect. And then we collect all the dependent variables at the end. And the persuasion-only condition, we don't do the affirmation. We provide them the persuasion. They never interact with each other till the end of the term, and we collect the DVs at the end. Notice in the persuasion control condition, there's only male TAs. We don't have female TAs. There's only a male TA. There's really only 1 session. There's hardly anything going on there other than the persuasion control. The contact condition, we collect background information and give them some points of similarity. We have them do a belonging jigsaw task. We have another jigsaw task, and we collect the information. We have male and female TAs who model respect for each other, all that good stuff going on in the contact condition. In the contact control, we just collect the same background information, but we actually don't use it. They actually find out about similarities to some other subject rather than themselves that the person has, so there's no actual similarity. They work on the same sort of task, but not in a jigsaw way. They build a bridge, they build a tower, but anybody can take over, and undoubtedly, almost always, the guys took over and left the women out. And then we collected the DVs at the very end. We had 3 important DVs at the end. One of the DVs was how much respect the men had for the woman who was in their group. All of these had women who were in their group, at least one. How much respect did the men put for the one woman who was in their group? Obviously a critical dependent variable. Then we ask, for those who had female TAs, how much respect did they have for the female TA versus the male TA? And we ask that in a very particular way. At Waterloo, there's a capstone course, which actually gets supervised by one of your TAs that you've had in one of your courses. And we ask, how interested would you be in having each of the TAs, the male and the female, when they're there, or just males if it was just male, how interested would you have them, how interested would you be in having them supervise your capstone course? And then the last DV is we had a female who they thought was an engineering student interview them to collect the DVs. And it's her rating of how subtly sexist they were when she interacted with them. She's totally blind to condition. Just how sexist is that guy that you interacted with as our critical dependent variables? Okay. So first I want to start with men's respect for women in their group. Now keep in mind that our persuasion-only control group, there were no groups. They just saw the persuasive video without any affirmation, and they didn't do any group activities. So we didn't collect this measure because it would have made no sense. How, you know, what you think of that woman in your group when you didn't have a group. So we didn't collect this measure. But what you see here is that control, compared to the contact control, both affirmation plus persuasion in green and typical contact increased respect for the female colleague who was in their group. Both of them seemed to work and work quite nicely and almost exactly the same. We get a different picture, though, when we look at how much did you want the female TA to supervise your capstone course. The male TAs are on the left, and everybody had a male TA, and you see you get about the same rating of all the male TAs as you'd kind of expect, and how much they'd like them to supervise the course. We have the contact and the affirmation plus persuasion, our intervention. Those have female TAs. They're the two that had female TAs, both of them did, both of them modeling respect in the same way. And what you see here is the affirmation plus persuasion. They're much more interested in having that female TA supervise their capstone course than in the contact-only condition. This is a common problem with the contact hypothesis to some extent. You seem to gain positive views to the person you had contact with and had especially the good contact with, but you have trouble generalizing it to other people. And that seems to be what's happening here, that they're not very, we didn't get more positive feelings about the TA in general in the kind of classic gold standard contact. And then this is the last little piece of data, which is how sexist did the RA who interviewed them think these guys were. And this is really ratings of respect, the opposite of sexism. So I said it backwards, but hopefully that can make sense. And what we see here is that the affirmation plus persuasion, the female RA who's interviewing them says, hey, I was treated with more respect by them than in the other condition, significantly more so than the contact-only condition, and then the persuasion control condition. The contact control condition isn't quite significant, but it's in the same direction. That one group seems to be having men who are actually interacting differently in terms of real behavior, in terms of what we can see. So this first study was pretty promising that we may very well be able to do things to actually persuade men to change their sexist behaviors. Even though they're subtle, that it may very well be possible to change men's attitudes towards sexism and the way that they end up displaying that. And for me, when I think of social identity threat, that's trying to move the change to where it's most important for it to be. I think it's going to be hard. It's not an easy solution, but I think it's the important solution that needs to actually happen in the long run. And although I was going to say some other things, I think, you know, time's basically up. So I will end there and take whatever questions you have. When you do ask questions, since they're, I guess, streaming this live, I will have you use the microphone, and Danielle will pass it around.
Maybe? Okay, yeah, I think so. My question is basically about the psychometric properties of the sexism scale. Great.
Sure. Oh, well, the psychometric properties. Well, the best way to think about it is it's a 3-item scale. And although it's subjectively coded, the Cohen's kappa is actually pretty good on it. I believe, this is from memory, it's like 0.82, the Cohen's kappa. So we get good inter-rater reliability. And the alpha, it's only 3 items, so you don't expect it to be all that great, is 0.82. So, I mean, the 3 items do tend to hang together. And, you know, so on those typical psychometric tests, that would be interesting. I often am underwhelmed by psychometric tests of reliability. I actually think we sometimes treat reliability as if it was validity, and that's potentially problematic. The one thing that's nice about this data is that the validity kind of evidence is right built into it. That first study that this actual scale, if you want to think about this sentence completion thing, actually is a measure of implicit sexism. It should predict actual behavior in a meaningful setting, and then it does. So I actually think the most important part of any scale psychometric properties is the validity data, and we almost never collect that when we're doing psychometric properties, which is weird. We should do that more. I think actually the validity argument is actually pretty strong for this, especially across the studies, and that was kind of built into it. So it's fine on the reliability measures, mainly because we didn't, you know, extract too big of a coding from it. But I think it's better on, and what I think is more important is validity measures than reliability measures.
I think it's on.
What got you interested in doing this kind of work, and what?
What's that? I'm sorry.
I'm wondering what got you interested in doing this kind of work as a man, and whether in your work you found that being a man has had any interesting effects, I guess, on the studies that you've designed or the communication of the results?
Well, a very good question. I mean, here I am sitting, you know, a straight white man, and I'm studying, you know, stereotypes and prejudice. Why on earth would you get into these things? Well, part of the reason that I got interested in these is these issues. When I went to graduate school, I started working with my advisor, Claude Steele. We were originally doing these issues of social identity threat, stereotype threat, it was called a bunch of things earlier. We were doing them with African Americans in the US, and Claude's black. So he was interested in stereotype threat for reasons that are easier for people to understand. And although that hadn't been historically what he'd studied, it was always in the back of his head as something he wanted to study. And, you know, so why he was interested in stereotype threat, I think is pretty straightforward. And as his graduate student, I became interested in it because he was interested in it. That's part of how graduate school works. But I became interested in gender and math actually in a really interesting kind of personal reason, which actually was a big part of why it shaped in important ways the work that we were doing, where we thought about stereotype threat no longer just about race, and we expanded it to gender and quickly thought about it more broadly. And for me, the issue was I had my sister-in-law at the time was in graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle in mathematics. And she was she was a couple years ahead of me at the same place where I went as an undergraduate, where my wife was from as well, so I knew her at least fairly well. She was super talented. She actually graduated second in her class from that college. She had all like A+ in math. She did, phenomenally well on her test scores. She was recruited heavily with a big fellowship at the University of Washington. She did fine for her first couple of years. She did exceptionally well for her first 3 years. But they have for a preliminary exam for when you become a candidate for a PhD. At that time, the University of Washington had this insane tradition where they had a qualifying exam that was had a theoretical part and an applied part. And 95% of the students historically failed one part or the other and had to retake it. She, like 95% of the people, passed one and failed the other. She thought, given her history, she was going to be different, and she'd pass both of them, and it just crushed her, which to me as a social psychologist was really, really interesting, because I had learned, this is kind of typical. If it happens to everybody, why would it crush you? You have this great background, you're really interested. Can't you just see that this is what happens? But no, she really had a hard time and actually never finished her PhD. And despite retaking that qualifying exam and then passing it, it just was a huge obstacle for her. And it dawned on me that what was happening to her in graduate school with math was exactly what was happening to the African Americans we were studying as undergraduates that Claude and I were looking at. And it's the same phenomenon. There's the stereotype. And when other people would think about it in a different way, that stereotype colors the way you think about an incident that's absolutely common. And it certainly played a big part in how I designed the research. That qualifying exam was like the exam that I gave here. Nobody's passing this thing. Everybody's being crushed by it. And, it was very much that created that kind of experience. And we thought that's exactly what's going on a lot of people when you first start out undergraduate and you get all these concepts you've never heard of before and they're all piling on. That sort of phenomenon is what we were interested in. So it helped us, it broadened the concept of stereotype threat, and it's where I got interested in studying these particular gender and math stuff. And I don't think there's really a lot more to the story of why I was interested in it than that, but there is that interesting personal connection, I think.
So have any of these interventions been applied or implemented in universities to a large extent? Or is it still in the study theory stage?
Well, that's a really good question. Some things yes, some things no. One of the things I hope that our engendering success in STEM project that we have is by the end of that 7 years from now, we will have things that'll be more ready to actually change the way that engineering programs are actually done. I think I see that as one of the primary outcomes of the grant that we're currently working on. Steve, Wright, and Odelia, who are sitting here, are part of the team. Leslie's part of the team. I think that that's one of the things that we'll have at the end. Now, saying that, there have been individual engineering programs that tried to do things and tried to implement them. And, I'm heartened by that. One of the very first studies I did at University of Waterloo did some studies at Virginia Tech, where we did that. And I think they tried to do some things after we did the studies there. I lost touch of the person I was working with, so I'm not even sure what ended up happening there. Also, Greg Walton, who was one of my graduate students, now has the belonging types of interventions he's now done at 27 different universities. and tested them out. And, he's pulling together all the data. Within the next year or so, there'll be a big paper with kind of a big rollout at many, many universities to see how those sorts of interventions work. So some of that's in the works now. But what I would say, we have to be cautious. One analogy that I make is to how medication gets implemented in the health system. Usually it starts with, you do animal studies in, if you're studying a medication, and if the animal studies look promising, then you'll do very simple, small trials of that medication. Then you'll do a little bit bigger trials at one particular location, and then you'll do a really big trial with a more representative sample. And if it passes each one of those, then you start thinking about, okay, can we give this medication to people in general? I think that cautious approach makes sense, although it doesn't follow quite the same way for what we're doing in social science. I think, again, you start with laboratory studies that we're doing often is the way to crystallize ideas and to understand causal relationships. But each time you move from that controlled laboratory setting to a real-world setting, you have to think about what does it take to translate that into the real world. And when you have it on a small real-world setting, what does it take to scale it up to a larger thing like a whole engineering program? And when you think of scaling it up from an engineering program, what does it take to implementing it across Canada, which is where we want to be? Those are real challenges, and they're not automatic that once you can do one, you can do the rest. And I think we need to, and part of what I hope we're able to do with this grant is actually show that we can scale it up properly before we rush ahead and try and implement these in engineering programs. We just need to do the basic research ahead of time. Yes, Dan?
I wondered whether the relationship between stereotype threat and performance was age dependent. You've talked about university populations. Is it happening in high school? Is it happening, elementary school? When does that correlation occur?
Well, that's a real interesting question. And one of the things that we're really interested in studying, so the part of the engendering success in STEM project that we're all working on is actually junior high and high school and understanding the dynamics there. There has been a lot less research done in junior high and high school, and even less in elementary years related to what we're doing. Now, the effect of stereotypes on actual performance, Andy Barron, who's also part of our team and has the youngest kids, he's shown stereotype threat effects with girls and boys in 4-year-olds. At Science World, he has a lab set up there, and he's actually done some very clever experiments with very young kids and demonstrated that with children as young as 4. Now, that suggests that these cultural stereotypes are pretty broad, pretty widespread, and if we think about it, it's not too surprising. We know that boys and girls seem to have really great understanding of gender stereotypes at a very young age. That's not surprising to anybody who's ever had a child. That's actually, or even if you haven't had a child, paid attention to children. They understand gender stereotypes exceptionally well from a very young age. So it's not surprising that that would have an effect. That said, there is this other interesting phenomenon when you look in school systems. Girls do better than boys in math and science right through grade 10. And if you look at the numbers in classes, that seems to be totally consistent through grade 10. One of the things that's really, really interesting, though, despite that, when we look at grade 11 physics, which is absolutely, you got to have it in order to go into STEM in university, we see a dramatic reversal. In a class, grade 10 academic science, 54% girls, 46% boys. Grade 11 physics, which you need to go into anything STEM, 65% boys, 35% girls. And so, we do know a little bit that about girls do great in the classwork. They're sticking with it through grade 10. But there is this particular problem that we know about at grade 11. So is there effects of stereotypes? We can see it as young as 4. Can it be overcome? Certainly girls seem to do a good job of overcoming it till at least grade 10, but maybe that's hiding something. Because at grade 11, when the class is absolutely critical for going on into STEM careers, girls aren't taking it up. So that's what we kind of know at this point. We're doing some new studies, and I didn't tell you about the new data we collected just this last summer, which, you know, we're doing more studies trying to understand exactly what's going on in those age groups.
So I'd like us to thank our speaker again. I think there'll be time to talk to him afterwards. He's a pretty gregarious person. So just before we go, first thing is that I'd like to thank our speaker, and as part of that, I'd like to present you with this gift on behalf of the Speakers Colloquium. If you don't know what it is, it's called a talking stick. Mm-hmm. It's been crafted by the artist Jim Yelton of the Coast Salish Nation, and the eagle is a symbol of great strength and leadership. So lead on, fearless leader. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize all the sponsors of this colloquium. This could not come together without all of these groups. Obviously, the university's president's office was fundamental in giving us the opportunity to offer this colloquium. The Department of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies, the Vice President of Research, SFU's key Big Data Initiative, also NSERC, Tableau, and our chair program has also gotten involved because we're big believers this is important. And the Faculty of Applied Sciences, as well as the School of Computing Science, have all at SFU contributed. And I want to thank you all for coming out and joining us tonight, and we hope to see you at the rest of the series. Our next talk is going to be on October 26th. It will be downtown at the SFU Harbor Center in Vancouver, room 1400. The speaker is Dr. Kathy O'Neill. She's a big data scientist, and she's author of the book Weapons of Math Destruction. And she talks about the challenges and issues with regards to big data analysis and how it impacts underrepresented groups. This is the one talk that we have that does have a fee, but it's quite affordable. It's $5 for students, $15 for not students. So I think you can afford it. And if you can't, then, well, we should talk, because $5, skip one coffee. No, seriously, I hope you can come out. She's quite exceptional. The book is also quite fantastic. I enjoyed it myself. And I hope now that you've enjoyed all this, please join us in the foyer for our reception. There's plenty of food. Please eat the food. The students who have been coming know about this, and hopefully they're prepared to eat lots of food. The rest of you, please help. Thank you again for coming out.